Hi everybody, welcome back. Miss Calabrese here. Today we're going to be talking about the respiratory system. All right, so first off, let's start with talking about what the functions of the respiratory system are. So main function is to provide oxygen to your tissues. So that means we have to bring in oxygen from the atmosphere and get it into the bloodstream, and then the blood can carry it to the tissues. Another important function is to eliminate carbon dioxide wastes. So as carbon dioxide builds up in the tissues from the cells they're constantly undergoing cellular respiration, we need to get that CO2 into the bloodstream and then from the bloodstream into the lungs and then out into the atmosphere. And also your respiratory system is important in maintaining the pH balance of your blood. And we'll talk about how that works as we move forward in this week's material. Okay, so the basic anatomy of your respiratory system is that we divide it into upper respiratory tract and lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract is your nose, your pharynx, and the structures that are associated with those. The lower respiratory tract is everything from the larynx on down. So larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. All right, so here's the pathway that air takes when you breathe in air. So the first place the air enters is your nasal cavity, because most of the time we're breathing through our noses. So air goes into the nasal cavity. It's going to go from the nasal cavity then into the pharynx. So the pharynx is a structure here in the back of the nasal cavity and the back of the oral cavity. So from nasal cavity to pharynx and then to larynx. Larynx is your voice box. And then down to the trachea. So the trachea is your windpipe that takes you down towards the lungs and the chest. And then we split here. So after the trachea, there's a split between the right primary bronchus and the left primary bronchus. And then each one of those two bronchi is going to split again into secondary bronchi. In each of the secondary bronchi is going to split into tertiary bronchi. And then we continue to split more, but after those tertiary bronchi, now we're just going to refer to those tubes as bronchioles. And we're going to split maybe 22 more times into different bronchioles, and then we'll end in alveoli, which are the actual air sacs where gas exchange takes place. Okay, so different zones of the respiratory system. So we kind of divide your respiratory system into the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. The conducting zone is just all of the structures that are going to conduct air into the respiratory zone. So that's nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, all the way down to the terminal bronchioles. That's all considered conducting zone because those are the pathways that we have to take in order to get air to the place where gas exchange can happen. The respiratory zone consists of just the respiratory bronchioles, which are these tiny little bronchioles here, and the alveoli themselves. So the alveoli look like little air sacs. They kind of look like a sack of grapes, almost like a cluster of grapes. So each one of those is an alveolus, is the singular term, and alveoli is plural. All right. So as far as the tissue that's lining your respiratory tract goes, most of the lower respiratory tract is lined with pseudostratified columnar epithelium that's also ciliated. So we can see the pseudostratification here because we've got kind of these off-kilter nuclei. We can see that they're columnar-shaped cells, but also that we've got a layer of cilia along the apical surface of this tissue, and that's going to help to conduct mucus. So as mucus gets produced, it's going to be carried by those cilia up towards the throat. All right, so now we're going to go through each of these structures individually here. So starting with the external nose. So yeah, your nose we can divide into external and internal. The external is the one you can see from the outside. The internal nose is a large cavity that's behind the nose. The internal nose is going to be divided with a nasal septum into the right and left nares. That's another word for nostrils. So left and right nares here. And we can see here that most of the external nose is cartilage, right? Whereas the internal nose is basically inside and wrapped in bone. Okay, so here's another view of the internal nose. Now this is a section that's been taken, um, a coronal section through the front of the face here, so we can kind of see um, the orbits here for the eyes. So I'm going to kind of outline those. And then you're looking at the inside of the nasal cavity here, and we can see there's a lot of stuff going on. So it's not just an empty hollow cavity. We've got these structures called turbinates or nasal conchae. So these turbinates or nasal conchae are basically bony structures that protrude into the inside of the nasal cavity. They're going to be lined with mucosa. And you've got three of them. So you've got superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae, lined with mucosa, and this is going to help moisturize and warm the air that you're breathing in through your nose, right? So if it's a cold day outside and you're breathing in cold air, that air is going to be warmed and moisturized by all the mucous membranes that it has to pass through in order to get to the pharynx. Um, so in all that mucous membrane, there are goblet cells. And whenever you see goblet cells, just know that those are cells that produce mucus. So there's a whole bunch of those goblet cells all throughout your respiratory tract and your digestive tract, etc. Also, at the top of the nasal cavity here is where you're going to find the olfactory epithelium. And so that's basically where your olfactory sense of smell is located. So all those olfactory nerves that are going to be attached to the olfactory bulb, which will take you down the olfactory tract and into the brain. All right, so after we leave the nasal cavity, the next structure that we reach is the pharynx. So the pharynx is a shared structure between two systems. So yes, it's part of your respiratory system, but it's also part of your digestive system. So it's going to be kind of a shared pathway for air and for food. Right, so looking at the pharynx itself, we can divide it into three different sections. So the most superior section there is the nasopharynx. So the nasopharynx we find at the back of the nasal cavity. The middle section is the oropharynx. The oropharynx we find at the back of the oral cavity. And then the last part, the most inferior part, is the laryngopharynx, and that's the one that's leading directly into the larynx. All right, so nasopharynx is where we're going to find your pharyngeal tonsils or your adenoids. It's also where we're going to find the opening of the eustachian tubes. So remember, the eustachian tubes are tubes that connect the middle ear to the nasopharynx to help equalize pressure in the middle ear. So that's basically what we find in the nasopharynx. Moving down to the oropharynx is where you're going to find your palatine tonsils and your lingual tonsils. And then the laryngopharynx is just the last part of this tube before we hit the larynx. All right, so the larynx itself is basically composed of these 9 different pieces of cartilage that create a passageway between the pharynx and the trachea. Some of the important structures that you'll want to know here just to kind of orient yourself. So this structure up here is the hyoid bone. So remember that the hyoid bone you find in your neck, it's the only bone in your body that's not connected to any other bones, and that's because it's connected to all these different cartilages here. Um, this structure right here, this is your thyroid cartilage, also known as your Adam's apple. Right, so the thyroid cartilage is just that kind of most pronounced cartilage of the larynx that you can kind of see moving up and down when you talk or when you swallow. Below that one down here is the cricoid cartilage. So cricoid cartilage is this kind of smaller one that is sitting sort of behind the thyroid gland, which is what you're looking at here. All right. Another view of the larynx here. So this is what we were just looking at, the larynx from the anterior side. If we turn this around and look at it from the posterior side, we can see in here is another structure called the epiglottis. So this epiglottis is going to be really important because it's going to sort of fold down and cover the opening to the trachea, when you swallow food so that food does not go into the trachea. So remember we said that the pharynx is a shared structure, but after the pharynx, we definitely want food to be directed back towards the esophagus instead of being directed into the trachea, because that would cause you to choke. So if we're looking at it from this side view here, so air is coming in through the nasal cavity, down through the nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx, and then we want air to move to the trachea, which is the anterior tube here. But if we're going to eat food, then the epiglottis, which is the structure in blue here, is going to fold down, cover that glottal opening, and then food should go down the esophagus, which is the next tube. Right. Another sort of view of the larynx here. So this is looking down through a larynx from the top. And we can see a couple important structures here. So one, we can see the epiglottis again, that's kind of folded up at this point. And then the vocal folds are these next structures here. So the vocal folds are going to be important for creating sound. So it's those vocal folds that are actually vibrating when you speak, when you make sound to produce all the different sounds that your voice is capable of making. So it's those vocal folds. And so that's looking at them from the top down. Looking at them from the side, these would be your vocal folds right here. And then again, epiglottis is this sort of structure up here. And in this position, it is open. All right, so a few questions here. The lower respiratory tract is lined with what type of tissue? What feature of that particular tissue helps to move mucus? What do goblet cells do? What part of the respiratory tract is shared with the digestive system? What tube connects the upper throat to the middle ear? What's the voice box? And what structure covers the voice box when we swallow? All right, so here's your answers. That lower respiratory tract is lined with ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. The feature of the tissue that helps move mucus is cilia. Goblet cells are cells that create mucus. Part of the respiratory tract that's shared with the digestive tract is the pharynx. The tube that connects the upper throat to the middle ear is the eustachian tube. Your voice box is your larynx, and the structure that covers the voice box when we swallow is the epiglottis. All right, so now moving from the larynx down into the trachea. So the trachea is your windpipe. This is a long tube that connects the larynx down to the primary bronchi, which will enter into the lungs. This tube is propped open with these semicircular rings of cartilage. So they're kind of C-shaped rings of cartilage that are there to keep the trachea propped open at all times. A lot of the different tube-like structures in your body, when they're not full of something, they collapse. But we can't have that with the trachea, right? We need continuous airflow. And it has to withstand pressure differences. So these C-shaped rings of cartilage are going to help keep that tube propped open so that we can get continuous airflow. All right, so here's what that looks like. So here we can see one of these C-shaped rings of cartilage that's helping keep the trachea open. And the reason that it's shaped like a C instead of a complete circle is because if you look behind it here, so just posterior to the trachea is the esophagus. And the esophagus is one of those tubes that when you're not swallowing something is pretty much going to be collapsed or pressed pretty flat. But when you do swallow something, so when you take a bite of food and you swallow it, we need room for that esophagus to kind of expand and stretch out to receive the food that you're swallowing. And so sometimes that esophagus is going to stretch out and kind of push on the trachea just a little bit. And so we can't have a totally rigid trachea. We need it to flex a little bit for when you swallow food. Okay, so here we can kind of see, so starting up top, hyoid bone, the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage, so all of this is larynx. Then we've got the trachea, which extends from the larynx down to this structure here, the carina. So carina is basically the fork in the road where your trachea ends and your two bronchi begin. It's also a trigger point for your coughing reflex. So if you inhale something and it makes it all the way down to the carina and something besides air, that makes it all the way down to the carina, it's going to trigger a coughing reflex, so you'll cough reflexively. Okay, so looking at those bronchi, so at the end of the trachea, we branch into the primary bronchi, which are these two large tubes here. One's going to go enter into each lung. And then the primary bronchi are going to divide once into two secondary bronchi. The secondary bronchi are going to divide into tertiary bronchi. And then each of those tertiary bronchi is going to divide again, and now we're dividing into bronchioles, right? And we have lots and lots of bronchioles. Right, so the tertiary bronchi continue to divide about 22 more times until we end in terminary bronchioles. I'm sorry, terminal bronchioles. The terminal bronchioles then branch one more time into respiratory bronchioles. The respiratory bronchioles are the last set of tubes before we hit the end of the road. All right, so as we go from trachea to bronchi to bronchioles, the actual structure of these tubes is going to change a little bit. So remember that the trachea was lined with these heavy C-shaped rings of cartilage to keep it propped open. We still have those cartilaginous rings in the bronchi, but as we move into the bronchioles, we're going to have a little bit less of the cartilage, and we're going to trade that out for more smooth muscle, right? So the structures are getting much, much smaller. So we're the cartilage is giving way to smooth muscle. And now when we have smooth muscle there, now we're under the control of the autonomic nervous system. So remember, your autonomic nervous system controls all smooth muscle activity in your body, which means that this smooth muscle here in your airways is going to be controlled by both sympathetic and parasympathetic tone. So if your sympathetic nervous system is activated, then you're going to see that your airways will dilate, right? So the smooth muscle will cause those airways to open up so you can breathe in more air. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense, because if you're in a fight or flight situation, you might need to direct a lot more energy to your lungs to get that airway flowing so that you can run away or fight or whatever it is you're doing. So sympathetic stimulation will open the airways. Parasympathetic stimulation will close them, not entirely, but it will constrict them ever so slightly, because if you just don't need as much oxygen for sitting on the couch as you do for running away from a lion. All right, so here's what the end of these bronchioles look like. So here's our terminal bronchiole up here at the top. Terminal bronchiole then branches one more time, and we get this respiratory bronchiole. And then the respiratory bronchiole ends in an alveolar sac. All right, so an alveolar sac here is just a cluster of alveoli. And this is where the actual gas exchange takes place. All right, so as we move down here into the respiratory bronchioles and finally the alveolar ducts that lead directly to those alveoli, we're going to see our tissue change again. So we're going to get a simple squamous epithelium here that's lining these alveolar sacs. And that's going to be really important, because this is where gas exchange takes place. We need the tissue to be very thin to allow for the diffusion of gases. Right. And then this entire structure here, so the terminal bronchiole all the way down through the alveolar sac, this is called a pulmonary lobule. And this is basically the functional unit of your lungs. So this is where the breathing is happening. Okay, so looking at as individual alveolus, so now we're really, really zoomed in this picture here. So we're looking at a single air sac, and we're going to talk about the different cells that compose that air sac. So first, let me kind of outline a single alveolus here for you. The cells that actually create the alveolar walls are called type 1 alveolar cells. Right, so these type 1 alveolar cells, these are the simple squamous epithelial cells that are actually creating the border, the barrier between the alveolus, where the gases are, and the capillaries, which are where we want to get those gases into or out of. Right, so type 1 alveolar cells are simple squamous epithelium that actually make up the walls of the alveolus. We also have some type 2 alveolar cells here. Type 2 alveolar cells are important because they make a substance called surfactant. And surfactant is going to be important in preventing the lungs from collapsing. So this is a substance that basically reduces the surface tension in the water that's in your lungs. Because you think about it, your lungs are wet tissue filled with air. So I like to kind of compare it to if you were going to fill a plastic bag with air, it would be easier to fill a dry plastic bag with air than a wet plastic bag with air. So if that plastic bag is wet, you can imagine that the plastic is going to want to adhere to itself and stay stuck together. And that same thing is true for your lungs. So all these little air sacs want to collapse and kind of stick together because the water has adhesive properties. Um, but the surfactant there is going to prevent that collapse of those air sacs. All right, another cell that we have in the alveoli are called alveolar macrophages, sometimes just called dust cells. So these are immune cells, part of your second line of defense, and they're going to be important for phagocytizing any material that makes it all the way down into the alveoli. So any little particles of dust, any little bacteria, viruses, whatever it is that you've managed to inhale, that's going to be the job of the alveolar macrophages to ingest and eliminate. All right. And as far as blood supply to the lungs, I want to make it clear, since we talked about the cardiovascular system a couple weeks ago, the difference between your pulmonary arteries and your bronchial arteries. So we talked about the pulmonary arteries in the context of those are the arteries that are bringing deoxygenated blood to the lungs so that it can be oxygenated. Right, so this is deoxygenated blood to the lungs in order to drop off CO2 and pick up oxygen. Your bronchial arteries, these are the arteries that are actually supplying the lungs with oxygenated blood. So your lungs are tissue just like all the other tissue in your body, which means they need their own fresh oxygenated blood as well. Right, so that's going to be the difference between the pulmonary arteries and the bronchial arteries. Okay. And as far as just gross anatomy of the lung here, so you have two lungs, obviously. The right lung and the left lung are slightly different from one another. So your right lung we divide into three different lobes, and the left lung is divided into two different lobes. So the right lung has a superior lobe, a middle lobe, and an inferior lobe. The superior lobe is divided from the middle lobe by a horizontal fissure. The middle lobe is divided from the interior lobe by an oblique fissure. So there's three different lobes in the right lung. In the left lung, we just have superior and inferior lobes, and those are divided by the oblique fissure. Okay, another picture of a lung here. So this is a cadaver lung. And we can see here, just as far as terminology goes, that the apex of the lung is at the top. That's the narrowest part of the structure. The base of the lung is the widest part of the structure. That's at the bottom here, or inferior. Also, just to note that your left lung has a structure called the cardiac notch. So remember that your heart kind of angles a little bit to the left side of your body, which means it's kind of taken up a little bit of space over there in your left pleural cavity. So you have to make room for it with this cardiac notch. All right, so last few questions here. Why is the trachea rigid? What is the carina and where do we find it? What structures are involved in gas exchange? What type of epithelial tissue is in the air sacs? What arteries carry oxygen-poor blood to the alveoli for gas exchange? And what arteries carry oxygen-rich blood to the tissue of the lungs themselves? So here's your answers. The trachea is going to be rigid because we need to prevent the collapse of that airway. There's a lot of pressure, negative pressure changes that's caused by inhalation. We don't want the airway to collapse when we're sucking air through it. The carina is located at the end of the trachea, the beginning of the primary bronchi, and it is a trigger for your coughing reflex. The structures involved in gas exchange are the alveoli. And the tissue that's found there is simple squamous epithelial tissue. And the reason is because we need diffusion to happen, so diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide across those membranes. The arteries that are carrying oxygen-poor blood for gas exchange are the pulmonary arteries, and the arteries carrying oxygen-rich blood to actually supply the lung tissue are the bronchial arteries. All right, so I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions.